Good morning or evening for our guests in South Korea. Thank you all for being here to discuss South Korea's election with us.
Mhm.
To begin, I'm glad to have KAI President and former U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, Kathleen Stevens, say a few words. Ambassador?
Troy, thank you. Yes, good morning to everyone, or good evening and everything in between. And thank you so much again for joining us today. I want to especially thank this great panel that Troy has assembled, who are joining us from Seoul and from the United States. He's going to introduce them shortly, but I just have to say a personal shout out to them. Kang In-sun, who was only recently in Washington, now back in Seoul. Thank you so much. I know it's late evening after a very busy couple of days. Former Assemblyman Song Ho Chang and Scott Snyder, who to my mind is one of the best analysts of Korean politics here in Washington or anywhere in the United States. Elections are a passion of mine, especially Korean elections. We've titled this session, The Implications of the Election, and we're going to do a lot of looking forward and looking at the results. But I guess I have to say, as a longtime Korea observer, when I watch elections in Korea, I think back to an election I witnessed in 1985, a National Assembly election where actually the turnout was 85%. It's a kind of forgotten moment in some ways in terms of Koreans' desire for democratization. So as I sat here at home in Washington, watching the live stream all day of the results come in from Korea, without respect to how the results came out, I really was inspired again by this expression by the Korean people in very difficult circumstances, obviously very different circumstances from 40 years ago, but very difficult circumstances to participate. One of the big questions in this crisis we're in is what is the viability and the resilience of our democracies? And I think in this, as in many other things in this crisis, we have a lot to learn from Korea. So I hope we can learn more from that experience, as well as think about what the implications are for Korea and for the region and for U.S.-Korean relations going forward as we examine the results. So thank you again for joining. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We'll have lots of these webinars in the future, and we hope to also see you in person, all of you, before too long in the future as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Stevens, for opening us up and for those kind words. We all know this was an important election in South Korea, but with much of the world still dealing with the outbreak of COVID-19, it's also an election that has resonance for other democracies as they try to work to contain the virus, but also consider how to take and hold elections during these trying times that we're all going through these days. To discuss all of these issues, I'm very glad that we have former National Assemblyman Song Ho Chang with us today, Kang In-sun and Scott Snyder. You all should have received their bios via email, but just briefly, National Assemblyman Song is currently the Managing Director of East Asia Strategy at Fiscal Note. Kang In-sun, who is joining us today from Seoul, is the Deputy Managing Editor for Diplomacy and National Security at the Chosun Ilbo. Prior to that, she was actually, as Ambassador Stevens said, here in Washington, D.C. as the Bureau Chief for the Chosun Ilbo. And Scott Snyder, of course, is the Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and the Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, I'd like to sort of jump in. Ms. Kang, you're actually there in Seoul. South Korea was one of the first countries to go through a major election since COVID-19 broke out. How are things on the ground in South Korea? How do you think the election went overall?
Well, overall, it went very well, I think. And I heard that maybe 47 countries in the world postponed their national level election. So, I didn't even know that, but we are the first country who did that. So boldly in the middle of, coronavirus outbreak. But actually, I don't think, election wise, it's just okay. There's nothing, the way we do is very different. We have lots of turnouts of the early votings. So actually, I myself did the same thing. So I went to do you want me to just explain how I did voting on that day?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I was there, and there were not many people because it was the first day of the early voting. And then the guy who was managing the process, he was screening my temperature. And then he he provided me hand sanitizer so that I can wash my hands. And then he provided me a pair of plastic disposable gloves so that I can put it on. And then I went to the polling station, and I cast the ballots. And then I just took up the gloves, and then that's all. But we was extremely cautious to keep the distance between people, person to person, so that we do not just get closer, to him or her. So I felt I was kind of safe in that moment. So I was quite satisfied with how I did with all that process. So, I mean, it was early voting was 2 days, and then there was election day, which is April 15th. So as far as I know, it did go very smoothly and kind of naturally and safely. Yeah.
So, National Assemblyman Song, I'd like to turn to you. We have the initial results from the election. President Moon's party, the Democratic Party of Korea, performed extremely well. I'm going to take and put up here, we have a chart that we put together briefly of, you can see how the party breakdown and everything went within the election. President Moon internationally has received a lot of praise for his handling of the outbreak of COVID-19 in South Korea. How much of a role do you think his handling of this outbreak actually played in the results that we saw this morning?
Oh, it's a big, yes. In in this election, this Corona pandemic is a big impact, but it's both traditional issues and the Corona pandemic seem to have had a big impact on this election. But before the pandemic, Moon's government faced many negative reviews on the economic policy, while the prosecution's reform had many the positive reviews. But after the Jo-guk's appointment as a justice minister, the issue of the prosecution's reform has become quite complicated, and people's reaction had been extremely mixed and polarized. So until then, it was hard to predict whether the Democratic Party would win. However, as the government quickly handled well to the Corona pandemic situation and received good reviews internationally, it favored the government to gain the positive reviews. It had a good influence on the Democratic Party in this pandemic outbreak. The Moon's government early action gives the people deepest impression, and it seems directly connected to the election result.
So, National Song, I'd like to just follow up briefly. You had mentioned at the beginning that prior to COVID-19, prosecutorial reform, economic issues were sort of some of the main driving issues of the campaign. If COVID-19 did play sort of a strong role, how important do you think the Democratic Party's position on those issues was in this election?
Yes, as I said before, is COVID-19, the pandemic issue is the biggest issue and the big impact to this election. But tradition issue also have impact, I think.
Thank you. So, Ms. Khan,
Yeah.
the Conservative Party coming into this election up until very recently had been actually quite divided since the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. What do you think the result, which clearly I think is probably disappointing for the Conservative Party, what is their future as an electoral force in South Korea after this?
Well, I think it's a little too early to say anything about the future of that political party. But as we have seen, the numbers says lots of things about the Korean Conservative Party. So I just talked with people about what's the meaning of the voters by not voting for conservative parties as much as they did before. So I guess this is the message for the conservative party, which is like you have to be prepared more about yourselves. Actually, they unite. I mean, they unite like it's 2 months ago, which was very recent. So sometimes, it's really hard for people to understand. I mean, to remember the name of the party itself. So, I mean, just the physical, just uniting or different factions. It's not everything about the politics. They have to show that what's their cause, what they will do for people, what they will do for the country. But that was not very clear. I mean, before the people were going to the polling station. So I guess the whole message is that, I mean, until you are ready to be prepared for a competitive party, then you have to prepare yourself first. So until then, we won't vote for you. I mean, that's a very simple message.
Thank you. Scott, so there were a lot of new parties and new candidates in this election. One thing that I think of interest is that we had Tae Young-ho running as the first North Korean for an actual congressional seat rather than as part of the party list. How did Mr. Tae do? There were other North Koreans in this election running as well. How did they do?
Well, I think that it's widely known and been widely, I guess, a headline from the election that Tae Young-ho won his race in his Gangnam district. And so that is the first electoral constituency that will be represented by someone who came from North Korea. The number of North Korean refugees in the National Assembly is also at a historic high because there is a proportional, because Chi Sang-ho was selected as a proportional representative for the opposition Conservative Party. The effort to try to establish a North Korean refugee party, the party itself did not do very well in the election. And so that produced no particular electoral benefit. But there are now two former North Koreans who are part of the National Assembly, and it'll be very interesting to see how they go about representing both their constituents and managing their identities as players at the National Assembly level in South Korea.
Scott, do you expect that they'll have a higher profile on North Korea issues and be able to have maybe some influence on North Korea policy?
Well, it would make sense that people with that background would be go-to people within their parties. It's almost like having an issue specialization, I think. But of course, the big notable factor is that these two North Korean defectors are part of the opposition. And so the ability of essentially they are now voices that the ruling party will have to contend with because those voices have been amplified. It's going to be very hard for the ruling party to marginalize those particular voices on North Korea related issues. But at the same time, their direct impact on policy making in the South Korean government is going to be diminished by the fact they're part of the opposition.
Just one last question, Scott, related to sort of these specific races. Were there any other individual races that stood out to you in this election?
Yeah, well, I want to build on what In-sun was talking about with regard to the opposition party performance, because I think that what is really notable is that the leadership of the Conservative Party was hit so hard with losses by Hwang Kyo-an, Oh Se-hoon, and Na Kyung-won. And so it basically means that the conservatives are in some disarray, and it's really going to require new faces as a way of moving forward. And the challenge there is the other kind of interesting race where we saw the former Conservative Party leader Hong Jun-pyo winning as an independent in Daegu. And so that's going to be a very interesting kind of sub-issue in terms of the dynamics within the conservative establishment, because Hong Jun-pyo, of course, ran in the last presidential election. He now doesn't have much competition for potential leadership among conservatives, and yet conservatives are going to need a new face if they're going to be able to compete effectively in 2022.
Yeah.
Yeah, I may add some other aspects. I mean, I really agree with Scott that conservatives need some new faces other than the one that we got used to. So, I mean, other than that, I guess, I mean, they have to show that they reform something, they reform or renew something. So, I mean, there should be something new. I mean, in terms of people or in terms of ideology or in terms of causes, whatever. I mean, you really need to provide something new.
I want to add this just a short something.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a reform for conservative, either the Conservative Party or the Democratic Party. Also, the reform is not enough. I think they have to focus on really what people want to do, and what Korean government, not just Korean government, any country government had to do for their people. This is, I think, is in the election, people really realized in this election, the future, the United Party, they just try to get something from the people, just try to how to say, they just try to show the motion or the action, but that's not the truth, and they don't. The people think that their party is really, they don't know, and they can't do. They don't have any ability to reform or run the country, I think.
Well, one of the things sort of keeping on this subject that I think that was interesting that came out of this whole process is that, you know, despite even the Conservative Party's own challenges this election, you have a situation to where, in essence, it's really gone down compared to at least the last National Assembly, almost basically a two-party system. The minor parties didn't seem to really perform that well. The Justice Party, I think, only got 11 seats. So it's really now the Minju and then the Conservative, the United Future Party. And so, Ms. Kong, I'm curious, there was changes leading into this election on how proportional representation would be handled. How did those changes, which were designed to actually try to help these minor parties, actually work out in the end?
Excuse me. Actually, that proportional representation system, I mean, as you just said, that this is purely for the small and minorities could go into the National Assembly so that they could put more diverse diverse opinions in Korean politics. But actually, when we have seen the result, actually, it didn't go that. I mean, it just went whole different direction. So we are discussing, do we really need the system? Actually, it didn't work as we expected it to be, as we have seen. So it just fortified the two main parties. I mean, it just serves for that, nothing more than that. So it was very disappointing.
So National Assemblyman Song, there was one other significant change in this election. The voting age was lowered to 18. We haven't really seen the demographic data yet, but how important is the younger generation in terms of electoral competition to both political parties in South Korea going forward?
Yeah, generally, generally speaking, the lowering of the voter age to 18 is the favor of the Democratic Party, I think. That the number is about the 550,000, the 8 years old voter have a right to vote in this election. This is 1.2% of the all voters. And many under 18 was involved in the Park Geun-hye impeachment campaign. Most of them are supporters of the Democratic Party. However, the number of young people has dropped sharply in Korea due to low birth rate. And the number of people that are 60 and older has increased relatively. So those in their 60s and older accounted for 12 million, and which is 27 point something percent of all of voters. This number shows 2.17 million, more than 4 years ago. So they prefer conservative opposition parties such as the Future United Party. In terms of demographics alone, the conservative opposition party is in much more favorable position in this election because 60s and older have a much higher turnout than younger generation. But many, even if 18 years old can vote, the demographic, the impact is not that big, I think.
So, Scott, turning to the actual implications of this election, in the last National Assembly, the Democratic Party of Korea had a plurality, but not a majority. Now they have, if I remember correctly, I think it's 3/5 of the seats. What does this mean for President Moon's agenda going forward?
Well, I think the ruling party is going to take this as a mandate for all of the elements of the Moon administration's platform, both domestic and foreign, that it has been pursuing. It's going to get a kind of shot. The Moon administration's agenda is going to get a shot in the arm. But in a way, the complicated aspect is that Moon himself only has 2 years left. Mm-hmm. And so that means he has a very short, relatively, period of time to try to implement an agenda from judicial reform to continuing work on North Korea to economic policy before the next election begins. And so I think the interesting thing is that on the one hand, Moon can claim a kind of mandate, but on the other hand, the competition to be his successor within the ruling party is probably not far off. And so on the one hand, we have this moment of cohesion and really success, but it can possibly very rapidly shift as individuals within the ruling party who are beneficiaries of this big win start to think about their own interests and future looking forward to 2022. And just, I want to add one other thing. Clearly, the main issue here that shaped the election outcome was the perception that the COVID crisis had been handled well. It really drowned out all the other issues. I think that in particular on economic policy, the broader trend toward public sector financial support for the public that has been part of the Moon administration's economic policy agenda, it's going to benefit from the broader global trend. And I think it's going to possibly reinforce the Moon administration's desires to use public sector financing as a critical means by which to try to improve the South Korean economy.
So, Ms. Kong, sort of keeping this Scott ended on of talking about the National Assembly and the COVID crisis, Um, One of the first issues on the National Assembly's plate is likely to be additional stimulus. How do you see that potentially going forward, and what might be on the table?
I mean, are you talking about the direct payment, which is
Um,
emergency disaster relief payment? Yeah, so I mean, as the government and governing party promised before the election, which I believe contributed a lot for them to win the huge victory. So the government is working on who is eligible for that direct payment. So they have announced today that the bottom 70% they will supply bottom 70% rule. But the governing party, they supported the idea of, I mean, it should go for all. So I guess still they are discussing who are eligible for that direct payment. But so, I mean, there's just, you need to just, rearrange it and then just coordinate the issues. So I guess it will take a little bit more, I mean, for people to really get the money in their pocket.
So, National Assembly song, I'd like to sort of, with your own experience in National Assembly, bring you into this conversation here about the actual implications of what the National Assembly will do going forward. How do you see this impacting the Moon agenda? And as a former National Assemblyman, what do you think the National Assembly, or the new members, will actually want to maybe prioritize?
About, you mean about this pandemic or after?
Or even in general? Like,
Yes, it's a huge victory for the Democratic Party, and this election show us Korean people really want to support the Moon administration and the Moon's administration's policy. So I think, and already the Democratic Party has more than half the seat of the National Assembly. So they for the more than 3 years, the Moon administration try to keep pushing the policy, the economy, the policy, and especially the prosecution, the reform policy. So they try to keep push that.
So, Scott, one last question on this, but taking more of a foreign policy perspective. There's been a series of issues. We have more challenges with maybe North Korea now, with the talks sort of on hold. There's obviously been the trade disputes between South Korea and Japan. Does this election create any additional space for President Moon to try and deal with these issues, or does it have very little impact on those going forward?
I think the election results does remove a constraint, a domestic political constraint on Moon as he pursues foreign policy. And it probably is going to strengthen pressure on Moon from his constituents to deliver on some of the core issues that they care about. And North Korea would be one of those issues. And so I can imagine that the Moon administration might feel like it can push harder on trying to find ways to promote economic integration with North Korea. That is an issue that potentially can generate some friction with the United States, as the US is still committed to a sanctions, a maximum pressure policy on North Korea. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes. And then also, I think that the burden sharing issue obviously is still out there. It's a very complicated issue. On the one hand, President Moon now has sufficient support within the National Assembly, I think, to force a deal through if he were to decide that he wanted to do that. So he's actually, in a way, empowered, but at the same time, he's empowered in a way that carries with it a lot of political risk. Because if he gives up too much in the eyes of the Korean people, or exceeds too much to President Trump's demands on burden sharing, then he and his party will own that. And so we're at this moment of transition. I think it'll be very interesting in the coming weeks to see whether or not it's possible for an agreement to be concluded and then possibly ratified by the lame duck assembly, or whether this ends up being taken up in the next National Assembly, or whether or not the Moon administration feels that they can wait out Trump, because we're only a few months away from our own elections in November.
So, National Assemblyman Song, you've talked about, and we've mentioned that this was a significant victory for the Democratic Party of Korea. South Korea only has a single-term presidency, so President Moon is ineligible to run again when the next presidential election comes up in 2022. How should the Democratic Party of Korea feel about their chances of retaining the Blue House in 2022? Or do you think that these results will probably have very little impact on that election?
Yes, now the leaders in Democratic Party, include the lawmakers, strongly believe that the candidates from their party will win again for the 2022 president election. The three main factors are President Moon's high approval rating, and the Democratic Party has many candidates, including the Lee Nak-yeon and a former prime minister in Korea, and Lee Jae-myung now is Gyeonggi province governor, and Park Won-soo, mayor of Seoul, and others too. And lastly, the United Future Party has no rival candidates yet, and now the result of this election, Hwang Kyo-ahn is resigned from the president of the party. So so far so good for the Moon's administration, because the biggest impact in this election was how the government handled the COVID-19, the pandemic. But as well as pandemic will end someday. And after this pandemic, the people will choose the next president with how well the government and the ruling party manage the economic policy and the foreign policy and so on. I'm talking about the traditional issues. So, however, things can completely change the political environment in 2 years. And this 2 years is not a short period of time to predict, and no one knows what will happen during that time.
That's very true. We have a saying here in the United States that 6 months is an eternity in politics.
That is too long period, and every country is same, I think.
Yeah.
True.
So and I'd like to turn shortly to audience questions, and if anyone in the audience has a question, if you could perhaps put it in the Q&A chat function, and I'll try to go through those shortly. But I'd like to close out with you, Ms. Kong, before we turn to the audience.
Okay.
It'll be a couple of weeks before we know, and there's already been a couple stories about whether there will be any increase in COVID cases in South Korea from going through with the election. But setting that aside, having seen the way it ran, are there any lessons you think that other countries can learn from South Korea's experience?
Well, maybe the next one, the second one first. I think, we have it was quite simple, but you have to be very cautious. As long as you are very cautious, I think it's not that difficult for other countries to go through the election as we did. But you need to be very careful in disinfecting the facilities, and by the way, just keep the distance between the people. And then that just basic principles are just, you keep that basic principles. I think other countries can try that too. But in fact, there are concern over the possibility that there could be a additional increase of infection. The positive cases, because as long as you are at home, that's the safest way to keep yourself healthy and safe. But anyways, you need to go out and you need to make a long line for waiting to vote. So you have a little bit of a risk then, I mean, unless you, well, whatever you do, I mean, you go out to vote and then you have more risks. So that's true. So we are, I mean, cautiously looking for whether there's some other additional things. And then the governments are very cautious in dealing that situation too. But so far, I mean, it's too early to say that. So next 2 weeks are very critical in that sense. Yes.
Can I add something to that, Troy? You know, what is really impressive to me is how the National Election Commission works to integrate the best practices as espoused by the KCDC, the Korean Center for Disease Control, into the process that Insun described for actually going in to vote. And there was basically a 10-step list of guidelines that the Election Commission put out for the voting process. It was very clear. And what she described precisely conformed to the process that they set up. And so in some ways, I think what's really interesting about the Korean election process is that actually is a triumph of bureaucratic management at a moment when it seems like everything is becoming more politicized.
And there's one thing I want to add is that, as you may know, that the people who were doing self-quarantine, they could vote too, because the government just let the self-quarantine people could vote after the elections over. So after 6 p.m., they could vote by themselves. So that you can just keep ordinary people be safe from that other, risks, and then you still keep them vote for the election. So I myself feel the same way. I mean, usually when you go out to vote, I mean, it's totally up to if you are willing to do. But in this case, you have seen some hurdle that you have never experienced. So I felt like, a real need to do, because there's some other difficulties that made me not to vote. So I feel more responsibility to show, to experience my duty or my responsibility and my right to vote.
Yeah, and I was reading this morning, I think, South Korean citizens did a really good job. There's reporting, I think only 6 individuals who had been self-quarantined due to COVID actually broke their quarantine during the election.
Yeah, I saw that too, yeah.
So,
can I add something? Yes, in this election, is the most important thing is to make people feel psychologically safe. In order to make feel safe, it is not enough to only make good measure vote. It should be equipped with a system that thoroughly manages and controls in the entire country to prevent for the spread of virus. In South Korea, in the early days, a well-prepared healthcare and the medical system, and the government implemented virus measures to create a great controlling system too.
So looking through some of the questions we have here, there's 2 questions that are similar on China, so I'll kind of group them together. One says it's from James Park at Johns Hopkins. Could the panel share your perspectives on what implications this election has on ROK-China relations going forward?
Well, there are, I mean, as you know, there are people, I mean, there are some kind of controversies over the Moon Jae-in government's policy not to shut the door from China in the beginning. So there are a group of there are people who wanted to shut down from China so that we don't have any more Chinese people. In those days, they were more exposed to the risks of being infected by coronaviruses. And then there are other people that we can still control and manage while opening the door to China. So there are it's a kind of domestic discussions. It's not talking to China. It's not about China policy. It's not going to affect the relations between China and Korea in that sense. But but after that, in return for that, China's policy was a little bit different. They shut the door from South Korea when we had lots of cases because of the Shincheonji cases. So that lots of people say that it was not very fair and friendly either. So that would affect the relationship in kind of in a sense about the relations between two countries. But in the long run, I guess we have to think about the whole thing. In later, because I think it's a little too early about the relation itself.
So I think that In-sun is right about the political issues in the Korea-China relationship related to this particular election. But if you step back and look at the Moon administration's policy toward China in its first 3 years, really there hasn't been much progress in the relationship. And we have to ask ourselves, is that because of a domestic political constraint, or is it because of some other structural issue in the South Korea-China relationship? And I don't see the problems in the South Korea-China relationship right now as a function of domestic politics, primarily because South Korean public opinion towards China is relatively cautious. And actually what happens in the South Korea-China relationship going forward, I think is going to depend less on the composition of the National Assembly than the nature of the approach that Xi Jinping takes towards South Korea. And so in that sense, I think that what's interesting is that Moon is operating from a strong position on foreign policy issues domestically, but on almost every issue that he faces, in order to make some progress, it's also going to require cooperation or some changes on the part of his counterparts. And so we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I may add one more thing over that, because now I guess it's the same in the States and in Korea too. We are going through an unusual situation because of the coronavirus. So it's really hard to say something under this pressure. So I think we have to wait until things are just, things are calmed down.
So I have a question here as well from Esther M. And she asks basically, with South Korea's success with COVID-19 and the successful election, is it possible for South Korea to turn this into foreign policy capital? Do we see any ways really that this could be a way to enhance sort of South Korea's foreign policy more generally?
I guess that's possible. Because it was one of the most interesting moments that I have seen these days is that President Trump gave a call to President Moon, and they discussed how Korea got over or handled the situation, which means because the COVID-19, this is the uncertain situation for every country. So we are equal in that sense. So if you have more advanced experience in your country, then you can just relay it to other country, so that helping other countries to get over the same cases. So I think that's something new and something that we have never imagined. But I think it's a good foreign policy asset that we can explore.
So I have a question here from former Congressman Donald Manzullo. He asks, what implications can American governors and the president learn from the manner in which the elections were conducted in Korea? US states have 50 systems with varying rules, but Korea has more of a unified system. Ms. Kong, you sort of touched on this in the last question I asked you, but I guess one I might ask you specifically, do you think the unified system in terms of Zula's question works best? And then maybe Scott and National Assemblyman Song, if you have any thoughts on this as well.
Well, I guess in Korea, it's I mean, the election system is very centralized and well managed, and it's you know that Korea is the country of the culture of efficiency. So it was. I mean, we also went through very hard times to get through these new, I mean, uncertainty. But finally, we have a little bit of kind of confidence about ourselves. Then, so it was relatively easy to try that system. So, I mean, I know that the United States is a huge country, so we have seen so many elections, but there are lots of issues in each state because each state has a different rules. So I think there may have some difficulties in adopting our experiences, but there are certainly good lessons and issues that you need to think of and then apply it in every state.
Yeah, I would agree with Insun that this is really a question of the applicability of the approach in a more centralized system to lessons, that can be applied in a relatively decentralized system where states have responsibility. But one thing that I would say is that, as we have seen in terms of the unique means by which the U.S. has been managing the COVID crisis so far, there is an opportunity for the federal government to identify and disseminate best practices, especially, for instance, the Federal Election Commission could borrow from the National Election Commission in Korea to make recommendations, and then it's on the states to decide how they want to implement those. But in terms of a seamless national elections implementation process, like what we saw in Korea over the course of the past couple of days, no, it's a different system here.
So, National Assemblyman Song, Haley Hae Kyung-an has a question sort of very much inside South Korean politics. And you had mentioned Cho Kuk previously in your comments. And basically, she's wondering if he might be able to come back now as a player in Korean politics. Do you see that maybe happening?
I actually I don't have no idea about that. But because there's too many things change it, and there's too many things impact to the politics situation in Korea, and we don't. I don't think it's this result of election is yes, the Democratic Party has more than 180 seats now. It's more than half, and they can do pushes actually everything they want to do. But I think the crisis for the Democratic Party would be come from this situation. It's always, I think, the crisis and opportunity has come together. But the Democratic Party or the leaders of the Democratic Party could think this is their opportunity and they can do everything they want, but that would be make the bring new crisis in the Democratic Party. Every politician and every party should remind that is that things, I think.
Scott, Aaron G. from RFA has a question that's sort of, I guess, to expand on how this impacts North Korea. How do you see this election having any impact on the U.S. DPRK talks rather than simply inter-Korean relations?
Not
think-
that.
I would say it depends on how North Korea responds. And right now, North Korea is closed to talks with either Washington or Seoul. I do think that the strong position of President Moon makes him a more authoritative potential interlocutor for North Korea, and it's really a question of whether Kim Jong-un wants to sees any benefit from trying to go down that road, because so far he has not.
So I also have a question from Tom Conyer. I'll sort of, because it's fairly long, summarize that, basically the COVID-19 pandemic sort of changed things, but ultimately has anything changed, and will Moon have to deal with trade issues and partners who are stumbling and continue to stumble in handling their health issues? Other than Moon and his party being a beneficiary from this election, what is the future in regards to the pandemic more broadly for South Korea? And I hope, Mr. Kanye, that I sort of rephrase that properly.
I mean, the future impact of the pandemic, you mean?
Yeah, in South Korea.
In South Korea. Well, I mean, that's also the issue that we need to digest for more time. But we learned some cases, like we had a MERS. We had experience of MERS a couple of years ago, and that changed a lot for us to improve our medical system. So that helped this time to get over this new the COVID-19 cases. So we need to just debrief what we have experienced so far, and then what we learned from the previous experiences, that you need to just reform the new lessons that you have learned that difficult experiences. So we need to the same thing again, and then what we need to just to change it. So I mean, pandemic will have lots of influence over various lives, like I mean, students are learning I mean, at home, and that they are not going to school, and then there are lots of people are working at home, and I mean, that's a huge change in our daily life, so that we may explore some other digital possibilities. We haven't just hurried that much if there's no COVID-19 cases, and other things like this is one of the issues that I'm very interested in as a national security thing. I mean, I have a friend whose sons and cousins are in the military service now, and then they are just in the base and doing nothing because they cannot go out. They cannot do any exercise because you need to keep the distance in the military too. So in that case, what should we do with our national security system with so many soldiers? And then, I mean, do we need this kind of like a big classroom, or like a big conference and events and everything? So I think it will drastically change our lives in many ways. That's what I expect to see.
So if I can just add, I think that the biggest advantage that the Moon administration gained in this election is that his handling of the COVID crisis gave Korean voters an opportunity to reward performance. And actually, prior to the crisis itself, there weren't many issues in the performance area that the Moon administration was going to be able to point to. And I think that that is actually what South Korean voters have yearned for a long time, is evidence of performance, and obviously they're willing to reward performance. And so now the challenge going forward is, as the crisis eases, there's going to be a continuing demand among the South Korean public for continued performance. And so it'll be interesting to see how the Moon administration organizes to meet that expectation.
Mhm.
If I,
So Scott, sorry, go ahead.
if I add something, yeah, I totally agree with Inson and Scott. And when I'm watching the how the Moon administration handled this pandemic, I so keep thinking, comparing with the fairy sale in the Park-geun administration. At the time, the people, the fairy sale incident. At the time, people could watch the fairy sale, which carried hundreds of high school students sink into the sea on the TV. And the maritime police were in flurry, and they were unable to rescue the people. No one knew where the president was during the day. In this pandemic case, President Moon has taken the lead in the spread of the virus from the outset, and the fairy sale. There was a how much is more than 300 deaths, and this pandemic is 229 something. So from this incident and this election in this pandemic, we have learned a lot, and that the government must conduct quick response to the crisis and the working system. Those are at least key things for the successful government to have, I think.
I may add one more thing. I guess, government work is very important, and their just quick response is very critical. But I guess that private sector is also very important in how do they cope with the situation. Just, everyone, basically to make yourself safe in this pandemic situation, you need to isolate yourself from other people. But eventually you got to realize that you are very closely related with other people. So you need to be very careful to protect the other people. So that kind of just caring other people gives us a very different, that feeling just make us do our responsibility. So, and then we have seen the devotion of the medical staff, medical professionals like doctors and nurses and other staffs. So that was another experience that how the private sector is strong in coping with this crisis situation.
No, I think that's a key point that, as much as we try to isolate, we all are connected and we need each other in the end. And
yeah,
we've hit 10 a.m. here in the United States and 11 p.m. there. But I would like to thank you all for discussing this with us today. And this is a really important election. I think we've had a really good discussion, and I appreciate all of you coming on today to discuss this with us. Thank you very much, and have a great day or great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy.
thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.